Early June had brought a spell of rare sunshine to the village of Little Brackenhurst, that pleasant and faintly overgrown place tucked between two lazy hill slopes and known mostly for its roses, its gossip, and its unabashed pride in the annual summer fete. This year's fete, held as always on the expansive lawns of Brackendale House, had drawn an unusually large crowd. One suspected the reason had less to do with community spirit and more to do with the return of the estate's elusive heir, Mr. Roland Sterling. He was, by most accounts, a rather grand young man, handsome in a sharp-edged way, impeccably tailored and entirely too aware of both facts. His arrival from London had caused something of a stir, especially among the more socially ambitious residents. Yet despite the flurry of excitement he generated, the real jewel of the fete was, as usual, the tea tent where Miss Jane Marple sat serenely, taking small sips from an impossibly delicate china cup and watching the world with her gentle, bird-like eyes. Miss Marple had been invited by Mrs. Dolly Bantry, who insisted that one simply could not enjoy the fete properly without a proper mind beside you to remark upon the absurdity of the village. Miss Marple, with modest protestations, had agreed. She had taken a quiet seat where she could observe without being observed too closely, a talent she possessed in rare abundance. It was, at first, an ordinary sort of village gathering, garden hats bobbing cheerfully, children chasing one another under the bunting, the vicar attempting to avoid Mrs. Plimpton's fruitcake stall, a light breeze carrying the scent of scones and chrysanthemums. Yet there was something beneath the pleasantry today, an undercurrent Miss Marple sensed at once, a tension too measured, too carefully concealed. Her gaze drifted toward the main house, where Brackendale Hotel, formerly Brackendale House, converted after the war, stood tall and proud, its stone facade gleaming. The morning light caught the upper windows, most innocently, but one in particular seemed to pull at her attention. Room 309. Its curtains, unlike the others, were drawn tightly shut, though the hour was barely past midday. "A curious choice," Miss Marple murmured softly, though only she heard it. Behind her, Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. "Jane, dear, you must look at Mrs. Chatterson's new hat. Looks like she's wearing an entire rhododendron bush on her head." Miss Marple smiled. "Yes, Dolly, most impressive indeed." But her pale blue eyes drifted once more to that shuttered window. A faint commotion rippled through the fete just then. Quick whispers, a nursemaid hurrying past, the hotel housekeeper wringing her hands as she spoke urgently to a policeman who had arrived with disconcerting speed. Heads turned, conversations faltered. Teacups paused mid-air. Something was wrong. A moment later, Mr. Roland Sterling strode onto the lawn, his expression ashen beneath all attempts at composure. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, a voice trembling just enough to betray him, I'm afraid there's been an incident upstairs at the hotel. A guest has been found. There has been a terrible accident. Or perhaps..." His voice dropped. "Something worse." Gasps fluttered through the crowd like startled birds. Miss Marple set her teacup down with impeccable care. Mrs. Bantry whispered, "Good heavens, Jane, you don't suppose—" But Miss Marple was already rising, smoothing her skirt with a practiced calm. "No, Dolly," she said gently. "I do not suppose anything at all. Not yet." Her eyes lifted again to that single shuttered window on the third floor. Room 309. A room where, scarcely 20 minutes later, they would discover a locked door, a fallen body, and a mystery that would shake Little Brackenhurst far more deeply than any summer fete ever could. Miss Marple followed the stream of anxious villagers as they drifted toward the hotel steps, the murmur of speculation growing louder with every passing moment. What had begun as a cheerful fete was dissolving into a tableau of alarm, the festive bunting above them fluttering now like nervous fingers tapping in the wind. She kept a steady pace, neither rushing nor lagging behind, watching the reactions of those around her more than the direction in which they walked. Mrs. Bantry clutched at her arm as they reached the hotel entrance. "Jane, dear, perhaps we shouldn't involve ourselves. It all sounds dreadfully unpleasant." Miss Marple's tone remained mild. "My dear Dolly, unpleasant things so rarely wait for an invitation." Inside, the hotel foyer buzzed with chaotic whispers. Guests huddled near the reception desk, demanding information that the poor clerk, white as the linen he usually handled, could not provide. The housekeeper, Mrs. Gedge, stood near the staircase, twisting a handkerchief into knots. Miss Marple thought she looked like a woman who had seen something she wished desperately to unsee. Inspector Caldwell, summoned from the nearby market town, arrived moments later. A stout man with a reputation for preferring straightforward answers, Caldwell wasted no time pushing through the cluster of onlookers. "Clear the way, if you please," he barked, starting up the stairs with purposeful strides. Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry followed at a respectful distance, not close enough to intrude, but near enough that Miss Marple could observe the ebb and flow of human behavior around the unfolding crisis. The climb to the third floor felt heavy with an unsettling quiet, as though the air itself resisted their progress. At the top landing, Mrs. Gedge pointed with a trembling hand toward the corridor. "There, Inspector. Room 309. I knocked and knocked, and when no one answered, I fetched the master key, but even that didn't work." "Didn't work?" Caldwell frowned. "Master keys don't simply decide not to work." "No, sir, it's the strangest thing. The bolt on the inside, it slid across." Miss Marple's eyes softened, a quiet spark of thought appearing behind them. A bolted door seldom meant anything simple. The inspector approached the room and rapped sharply. "Mr. Grayson? Mr. Martin Grayson, can you hear me?" His voice echoed down the corridor without reply. After a tense pause, he signaled to his constable. "We'll have to break it in." Mrs. Bantry grasped Miss Marple's hand. "Oh, this is dreadful." The constable threw his weight against the door, once, twice, and finally a third time before the bolt gave way with a violent crack. The door swung inward, revealing a room that looked, at first glance, perfectly ordinary. But the stillness inside was wrong. Too arranged, too quiet. A half-finished cup of tea sat cooling on the small table beside the armchair. A newspaper, folded neatly, lay on the floor as though dropped rather than placed. And on the carpet, leaning unnaturally against the foot of the bed, sat the motionless figure of Mr. Martin Grayson. Inspector Caldwell strode forward, crouching beside him. "Dead," he muttered grimly. "Neck broken, and with the door bolted from the inside, this doesn't look like any ordinary crime." Miss Marple lingered at the threshold, taking in the details the inspector had not yet had time to notice. The faint indentation in the carpet by the desk, a slight misalignment in the curtains, drawn hastily rather than carefully, a teacup with a single lip mark, but two faint rings of steam on the tray where another cup had once stood. "Jane," Mrs. Bantry whispered behind her, unable to tear her gaze away from the body. "How could something like this happen in broad daylight?" Miss Marple did not answer. Not immediately. Instead, her eyes traveled slowly around the room, her thoughts turning quietly. Because something else was wrong, something delicate, almost invisible, but unmistakably out of place. And it was this subtle wrongness, more than the locked door or the broken body, that told Miss Marple they had not found a puzzle. They had stepped into one that had been deliberately constructed. Inspector Caldwell rose slowly, brushing his hands on his trousers as though the gesture might clear his mind as well. The constable hovered near the door, unsure whether to inspect the room or guard it. Miss Marple stepped quietly inside, her presence so unobtrusive that Caldwell did not at first notice she had crossed the threshold. It was Mrs. Gedge, pale and trembling, who finally spoke. "I only came up to bring him extra towels, sir. He asked for them earlier." around 11. Perfectly well he was. A bit nervous, perhaps. He kept glancing over his shoulder, though he tried to hide it. But alive, certainly. "When did you last see him alive?" Caldwell asked sharply. "Just then, sir. 11 this morning." She dabbed at her eyes. "And when the church bells rang the half hour, I passed by again. The door was shut. I didn't hear anything." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the tea tray. 11 o'clock. And yet the steam marks suggested 2 cups had rested there recently. One had been taken away. One remained. Inspector Caldwell followed her line of sight. "Ah, Mrs. Marple." He cleared his throat, attempting a respectful tone that couldn't quite mask his impatience. "Best you stand back. This is unpleasant business and—" "Oh, but I assure you, Inspector, I'm quite steady," she replied, her voice gentle, almost apologetic. "Besides, things often speak more clearly when one doesn't rush to silence them." He blinked, unsure what she meant, but she lowered her eyes again, returning her attention to the room. The body was slumped just so, too deliberately positioned, Miss Marple thought. Not the collapse of a man who had fallen unexpectedly, but the staging of someone who wished it to appear so. The neck was broken, as Caldwell had stated, yet the expression on the man's face, frozen in a taut, startled grimace, betrayed an instant of recognition, not confusion. He had known his attacker, and likely trusted them enough to open the door. Inspector Caldwell, meanwhile, proceeded with the practical questions. "Mrs. Gedge, who else has access to this floor? Any staff? Any guests who might have wandered this way?" "Oh, no, sir. These rooms are all occupied for the fete weekend, but most guests are out enjoying themselves. And Mr. Grayson, well, he didn't seem the type to invite visitors." She paused, hesitating. "Though he did receive a letter this morning. I found it pushed halfway under his door." "Did you read it?" Caldwell demanded. "Certainly not," she gasped, scandalized. "But he read it right away, looked dreadfully upset afterward. Went out for a walk to calm himself, I believe." Miss Marple's head tilted slightly. "And did he return, quite alone?" I assume so. I didn't see him come back, but I heard his door close just before noon." Miss Marple's eyes softened. So the timeline narrowed. A letter, a walk, an unseen return, a bolted door, and a second cup of tea taken by someone who had since vanished without a trace. And yet no one in the hallway had seen a visitor enter or leave. That, if anything, stood out most plainly. "Inspector Caldwell," Miss Marple said in her mild, thoughtful tone, "may I trouble you to look at the bolt?" He frowned, but obliged, stepping to the door and examining the mechanism. It hung loose from the forced impact, but the screws showed no unusual marks. "A simple bolt, Mrs. Marple. Slid from the inside. Means what it means." "Yes," she replied softly. "Indeed it does." Caldwell turned back to the scene. "Constable, fetch Dr. Redwood. And tell reception no one leaves this floor. I want statements from all residents." As the constable hurried away, the inspector exhaled heavily, rubbing his temples. This is madness. A locked door, a dead man, no weapon, no sign of struggle, and in a hotel full of people. Miss Marple's fingers lightly brushed the lace edge of the curtains. "Madness, Inspector? Oh, I wonder. A touch of cleverness, perhaps. And cleverness, when misapplied, often appears quite mad." Caldwell shot her a puzzled look. "You think someone staged this?" "Why?" "Because," she murmured, "they wished to direct attention away from themselves, and a locked room always lends a sense of impossibility that people find terribly distracting." Before Caldwell could respond, hurried footsteps sounded in the corridor. Mr. Roland Sterling appeared in the doorway, breathless and visibly shaken. "Inspector Caldwell, Miss Marple. There's something else. One of the guests downstairs says he saw Mr. Grayson arguing with someone this morning near the rose garden." An uneasy quiet settled over the group. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. "And who," she asked kindly, "was he seen with?" Roland swallowed hard, glancing toward the stairs as though expecting someone to appear there at any moment. He said it was, well, it sounded like it was me. And with that, the first suspect stepped neatly into the center of the stage. Roland's admission lingered in the air like an unwelcome draft through an old church door. Inspector Caldwell raised an eyebrow, his suspicion sharpening in an instant. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that a witness saw you, Mr. Sterling, in a heated argument with the deceased this very morning?" Roland's throat bobbed as he swallowed. "Yes, or at least that's what the man claims. I don't recall any such encounter. I've never even met Mr. Grayson before today." Mrs. Bantry, who had been listening from the hallway, gasped softly, pressing a hand to her pearls. Miss Marple, however, regarded Roland with a look that was neither accusatory nor forgiving, merely observant, as though she were watching the subtle shift of a leaf in the breeze. Inspector Caldwell folded his arms. "Not the sort of thing one forgets." "I understand that," Roland replied quickly. "But I swear, Inspector, I've been busy all morning helping set up the fate stalls." "Half the village can confirm it." Caldwell's skepticism remained visible, but he did not press further. Not yet. Instead, he turned to Miss Marple, perhaps seeking silent confirmation of his own intuition. She merely offered a faint, non-committal smile. "Inspector," she said gently, "if someone wished suspicion to fall on Mr. Sterling, it would be most convenient for a single witness to claim such a scene, particularly if that witness cannot be immediately verified." Roland looked at her with sudden gratitude, though she had not quite exonerated him. Caldwell grunted. "We'll speak to this witness directly. Who is he?" "He wouldn't give his name," Roland replied, wincing at how suspicious that sounded even as he said it. "He just pulled me aside downstairs and muttered something about it before hurrying off." "Ran off, did he?" Caldwell snapped. "Very convenient." Miss Marple's gaze drifted back to the room, the bolt on the door, the single teacup, the newspaper on the carpet. She took a few slow, thoughtful steps toward the small writing desk. Her attention focused on a sheet of hotel stationery lying on top, crisp and uncreased, save for the faint indentations of handwriting, as though someone had written something on a page above it and removed the top page in haste. Her fingertips brushed lightly over the impressions. A few words could just be made out, scraps of a message at best. "Tonight, dangerous. Trust, interesting. Very interesting." But before she could lean closer, Inspector Caldwell called sharply to Mrs. Gedge. "I'll need the exact list of guests on this floor. No one goes anywhere until I've spoken to each of them." Mrs. Gedge nodded and bustled away, eager to be useful if only to distract herself from the horror of the morning. Roland moved to the doorway, his expression drawn. Miss Marple followed him with her eyes, taking in the stiffness of his movements, the tension in his shoulders. Not guilt, she thought, not quite, but worry, deep and genuine. He looked back at her suddenly. "Miss Marple, you don't really believe I had anything to do with this, do you?" She gave him a gentle smile, the sort that soothed rather than reassured. "Oh, my dear young man, I believe very little until all the pieces are in place. People are often terribly quick to assume what they wish to believe. But truth, Mr. Sterling, truth takes its time." Roland exhaled shakily and nodded, though her words had not fully eased him. Inspector Caldwell was pacing now, scanning the room again, searching for anything he might have missed. "One thing's clear," he muttered. "Whoever did this was inside this room with Mr. Grayson. The bolt proves that. The question is how they got out." Miss Marple, still near the writing desk, looked toward the window. Its curtains were drawn, the fabric trembling slightly in the draft. The latch was closed, but not firmly. A thought drifted through her mind, light and quiet, but insistent. Some locked rooms, after all, are only locked in the direction one happens to look. She stepped closer, drawing back the curtain just enough to inspect the frame, and there, ever so faint, a small scuff mark on the outside sill, barely visible, easily missed. "Inspector," she said softly, "I wonder if you might join me a moment." Caldwell huffed but approached. "What is it now?" Miss Marple touched the scuffed paint with her fingertip. "It seems someone used this window recently." Caldwell leaned forward, squinting. "Could be anything. Rain. Wear and tear." "Oh yes, Inspector," she replied kindly. "Very possibly, except that the mark is fresh and quite distinct, and Mr. Grayson, I believe, was not in the habit of climbing out windows." Caldwell frowned. "So you think the killer escaped this way?" "But we're on the 3rd floor. They'd have broken their neck." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured, still gazing out. "Unless, of course, they had no need to climb down at all." Her eyes drifted toward the large ornamental stone ledge that ran the length of the building's facade, just wide enough for someone nimble and desperate to traverse, and just high enough above the garden that no one below would think to look up. Inspector Caldwell followed her gaze and went still. Roland Sterling, who had been lingering near the doorway, took a step forward. "Are you saying someone walked across that ledge?" "On purpose?" Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. "Only that the door was bolted. The window was not, and desperation, Mr. Sterling, can make acrobats of the most unlikely individuals." The room fell into a stunned silence as all three contemplated this. Then, somewhere down the hall, a door slammed sharply. Several voices rose in alarm. Miss Marple turned her head, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly, because the sound had come from a room she had noted earlier, one whose occupant had not yet made themselves known. Room 311. And she had the distinct feeling that whoever had slammed that door was no longer inside it. The sudden slam echoed down the corridor like a judge's gavel, drawing every lingering whisper into silence. Inspector Caldwell turned sharply toward the sound, his hand instinctively moving toward his pocket notebook instead of his revolver. This was England, after all, and hotel corridors rarely demanded firearms. "Constable," he barked, though the young man was nowhere in sight. "Blast it! Where has he gone? Mrs. Gedge?" But Miss Marple was already moving, her steps small yet purposeful. She reached the corridor first, peering down its length with calm attentiveness rather than alarm. Doors stood half open as curious guests leaned out, whispering amongst themselves. And there, halfway down, room 301's door was indeed ajar, just a fraction, as though someone had hurriedly pulled it shut and miscalculated the angle. Miss Marple paused only long enough to absorb the overall picture. Light footprints on the carpet, slightly disturbed. A faint scuff near the skirting board. And interestingly, the faint scent of something sharp and citrus-like in the air. Not perfume. More like the tang of recently opened lemon polish or disinfectant. Inspector Caldwell, puffing slightly, caught up to her. "Mrs. Marple, I must insist you let the police handle this." "Oh yes, Inspector," she murmured absently. "But it's so easy to lose track of little things when one rushes. And little things are always the most important." Caldwell knocked briskly on the door. "Room 301. Open up, if you please." Silence followed. Thick, stubborn silence. He pushed the door open fully, stepping inside with a caution that bordered on irritation. Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry peered over his shoulder, though the older lady clutched her handbag anxiously, as though it were a shield. Room 311 was neat, tidy, and unremarkable. Suitcase on its stand, wardrobe half open, a pair of men's shoes placed neatly by the bed. But the sense of vacancy was unmistakable. Whoever occupied the room was no longer there, and had left in haste. "Looks like someone scarpered the moment they heard us talking," Caldwell muttered. "Well, that's suspicious in itself." Miss Marple drifted toward the window, her eyes lightly scanning the corners of the room. She noted the absence of a teacup on the tray, unlike the other rooms. She noted the suitcase, half-packed rather than half-unpacked, and she noticed the wardrobe door, which hung open at a wider angle than the other. Caldwell busied himself with rifling through the bedside table. "Name on the register, Mr. Philip Langford. Arrived late last night. No occupation listed." "Langford," Miss Marple repeated softly. "Such a familiar name. I wonder—" Her gaze had settled on the carpet just inside the wardrobe. A single thread clung to the corner, dark navy wool, so small it could have been dismissed as lint, but it tugged gently at her mind, connecting itself to a detail she had observed the moment they entered Mr. Grayson's room. She reached down delicately and lifted it between her fingertips. Mrs. Bantry leaned closer. "Jane, what on earth is that?" "Oh, nothing by itself," Miss Marple replied. "Merely a thread. But threads are rather like truths, Dolly. Once you pull one, you begin to unravel what's been so carefully concealed." Before Mrs. Bantry could respond, Caldwell straightened. "No sign of him. Must have gone downstairs. Constable." He attempted again, louder this time. "Find the blasted—" A shout rose from the floor below, accompanied by pounding footsteps. Caldwell swore under his breath. "That'll be him. Come on." He barreled out of the room with Mrs. Bantry flusteredly hurrying after him. Miss Marple paused only a moment longer, her eyes drifting to the suitcase by the bed. Half-packed. Ready to leave. Odd, since most guests were staying through the weekend. And even odder that a man would abandon a room with such speed after a single door slam nearby. She touched the suitcase lightly. It was closed, but not locked. And on its leather handle, almost hidden beneath the stitching, was a small smudge. Not dust, not dirt. Something darker. Ink. Miss Marple lifted her gaze slowly, her mind turning back to the indentation on the writing paper in room 309. Someone had written a note, hurriedly, urgently, and then snatched the page away. She tucked the thread carefully into her handkerchief. As she stepped into the hall, she heard more running, more shouts from below. The inspector was already halfway down the stairs, his heavy footfalls unmistakable. But Miss Marple did not rush. She descended at her own pace, one hand on the banister, her expression serene though her thoughts were swiftly aligning. At the bottom of the stairs, a crowd had gathered. The inspector was speaking to the constable, who looked flustered and red-faced. "He ran through the back corridor, sir. I tried to catch him, honestly I did, but he slipped out the service door before I could get round." "Slipped out?" Caldwell thundered. A likely story, unless he had help. Voices murmured agreement. The tension thickened once more. Miss Marple stepped forward gently. "Inspector Caldwell, might I ask where the service corridor leads?" Caldwell turned, frustrated but not unkind. "Leads to the staff courtyard. From there onto the hotel grounds. But it's fenced. He can't have gone far." Miss Marple murmured. Unless he knew precisely where he was going. Roland Sterling pushed through the crowd then, breathless again. "Inspector, someone saw Mr. Langford running toward the old greenhouse near the north lawn. It's overgrown, easy to hide there." Caldwell groaned. "The greenhouse? Oh, marvelous. Everyone stay inside the building." He signaled to the constable. "You and I will check the grounds." But Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on his sleeve. "Inspector, do you recall the mark on the window ledge in room 309? He blinked. "Yes. What about it?" "Well," she said softly, "I do wonder if whoever fled down that corridor might not be running away from us at all." Caldwell frowned. "Then what?" Miss Marple's eyes lowered to the thread she had tucked into her handkerchief. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "they are running toward something, or someone, they very much wish to protect." And though no one could yet see it, the true shape of the mystery had begun to shift. The threads were tightening, and someone, somewhere on the grounds of Brackendale Hotel, was tugging back. The inspector's boots had barely struck the gravel path outside before Miss Marple slipped quietly through the side door that opened onto the rose garden. She was not following the inspector. Not truly. She simply preferred to see the grounds for herself before heavy police footsteps disturbed whatever clues the earth might still hold. The June sun had become softer now, casting gentle shadows through the trellis that lined the walkway. Bees hummed lazily, unaware that the air carried more tension than summer sweetness. Miss Marple moved at a thoughtful pace, her eyes scanning not for the obvious signs of a chase, but for the subtle missteps left by a frightened man. Roland Sterling caught up with her at the garden's entrance, breathless yet again. "Miss Marple, are you quite sure you should be wandering out here alone? If Mr. Langford is dangerous—" "Oh," she replied in her mild way, "I've always found that dangerous people rarely notice those who do not appear to be noticing them." Roland opened his mouth, then closed it, uncertain whether she was joking. Miss Marple's gaze had drifted downward. The path that led toward the north lawn showed faint impressions, uneven, hurried, one foot dragging slightly. They were not deep enough to belong to the heavy inspector, nor the constable. These prints belonged to someone light on their feet, but not accustomed to running. "The greenhouse," Roland murmured. "That's where the witness said Langford went." She responded. "I wonder whether that was where he intended to go, or merely where someone wished us to believe he had gone." Roland frowned. "You think the witness was lying?" "Not necessarily lying," Miss Marple said, stepping around a rose bush with delicate precision, "but perhaps misled. People often see only what they expect to see." A faint rustle drifted from the tall hedges behind the tool shed. Roland tensed, but Miss Marple lifted a calming hand. "Not that way," she said quietly. For her attention had fixed on the old greenhouse, visible through the climbing vines and cracked glass. But she was not looking at the greenhouse itself. Rather, she was looking at the ground just before it, where the earth had been disturbed in an oddly careful manner, as though someone had tried very hard to make it appear casual. Footprints approached the greenhouse door, but none left it. Miss Marple stepped closer. Curious. Roland blinked. He must still be inside, then. "Should I fetch Caldwell?" "I think not," she murmured, tilting her head. She reached out and touched the greenhouse door. It was slightly ajar, just enough for a person slipping inside in a frantic hurry. But the hinges were wrong. The door had been opened recently, yes, but not wide enough to allow a man to pass. Someone had pulled it open and then pushed it almost closed again, from the outside. Roland stared. "I don't understand." Miss Marple moved along the side of the greenhouse, peering through a broken pane. Dusty tools hung in place. A watering can lay overturned. Sunlight glinted on a rusted trowel, but not a single sign of movement. "Mr. Langford," she said thoughtfully, "is not inside this greenhouse. But his footprints—" "Approach," she said gently, "but never enter. He wanted it to look as though he had gone inside. A misdirection." She paused. "The question is, who was he misleading? The police, or someone else entirely?" A soft breeze lifted the hem of her cardigan, carrying with it the faint lemon-scented trace she had smelled earlier in room 311. Roland hesitated. "Do you think he's dangerous?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that danger is rarely where people expect to find it." She turned her attention back to the footprints. One in particular caught her eye. A deeper impression, the heel digging sharply into the soil. "A sudden stop," she murmured. "He paused here." Roland crouched beside her. "Why pause here?" "Because something frightened him." Roland said nothing, but the tremor in his voice gave him away. Miss Marple continued, her voice soft, almost thoughtful. "You see, Mr. Langford ran with purpose until this point. Then he turned, quite abruptly, and from the angle of the footprint, he turned not toward the greenhouse, but toward the back of the hotel." Roland froze. Back toward the rooms. Exactly. Her eyes lifted. Specifically, toward the windows of the third floor. A silence settled between them, filled only by the quiet hum of summer air. Miss Marple straightened slowly, her gaze fixed on a spot above the hotel facade, the ornamental ledge that ran beneath room 309 and room 311. Mr. Langford wasn't fleeing the hotel grounds, she whispered. He was returning. Roland's voice dropped to a whisper. Why would he go back? To meet someone, Miss Marple answered, her tone turning almost grim. Who expected him? And then a new sound broke the quiet, distant but unmistakable. A scream, high, sharp, and coming from somewhere inside the hotel. Miss Marple did not hurry. Her steps remained steady, composed, but her eyes had changed entirely, clearer, sharper, more piercing than Roland had ever seen. Because this scream did not signal panic. It signaled the moment the careful mask covering this mystery had finally begun to slip. Miss Marple and Roland Sterling exchanged a glance, the meaning of that scream threading silently between them. Without a word, they moved toward the hotel, slipping through the rose garden and back along the side path that led to the main entrance. The village fête had descended into chaos. Shouts and hurried footsteps echoed from the lawns as guests sought answers to the sudden alarm. Yet for all the commotion, Miss Marple's pace remained calm, her eyes taking in the scene with the practiced precision of a bird observing a garden in spring. Inside, the lobby was a tangle of startled guests and anxious staff. Inspector Caldwell was already there, his face taut with frustration, directing the constables with clipped, urgent gestures. Everyone stay calm. No one leaves the building until we know what we're dealing with. Mrs. Gedge, check the third floor, now. His voice carried the weight of authority, but beneath it lay a tension that Miss Marple could read as clearly as a handwritten letter. They hurried up the staircase, following the echo of the scream. At the top landing, the hallways were almost unnaturally quiet. The doors to rooms 309 and 311 stood open, the former cordoned off by the inspector, the latter still undisturbed. But at the far end of the corridor, a new window, the small staff window at the corner of the landing, stood slightly ajar, quivering in the breeze. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the faint disturbance in the carpet nearby. Someone had brushed against the edge of the rug, leaving a thin trail of dirt that led toward the nearest guest room. A murmur of voices came from the direction of room 310. Miss Marple quickened her steps, followed closely by Roland. Inside, the room was sparsely furnished. The occupant, Miss Helen Cairns, a young widow from the neighboring village, standing with her back to them, staring at the window in horror. Her hands clutched a handkerchief, knuckles white, and her lips trembled as she muttered, I thought I heard someone climbing in. It came through the window. I ran, I swear. Inspector Caldwell arrived behind them, his expression a mixture of relief and irritation. Miss Cairns, calm yourself. Did you see who it was? I don't know. Only a shadow, but it was... Oh, it moved so swiftly, and then... She shook her head violently. Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice soothing. My dear, no need to speak too fast. Just tell me what you remember. Even the smallest detail may help. Helen's eyes were wide, fear mingling with confusion. The curtains, they stirred, and there was a glint, like sunlight on metal, but moving, and then it was gone. Miss Marple's eyes flicked toward the window ledge outside. A quiet, knowing smile touched her lips. Sunlight on metal, you say? Yes, that fits. Very well observed, my dear. Thank you. Caldwell's impatience bubbled over. Miss Marple, what on earth are you suggesting? Someone climbed across the ledge. Perhaps, she replied softly. Or perhaps someone wished us to believe they did. She touched the faint scuff mark on the sill. The marks are fresh, and the window unlatched from inside at some point. Roland's voice trembled slightly as he looked from Miss Marple to the window. "You mean he or she was up here, returning to the rooms? But how?" Miss Marple's eyes scanned the corridor. "Desperation makes people clever, Mr. Sterling, and sometimes cleverness is enough to make the impossible seem entirely natural." She gestured subtly toward the hall. It seemed someone was very determined to manipulate appearances, to suggest a presence where there was none. The inspector stepped forward, exasperated. "Manipulate appearances? Miss Marple, the man is dead. And now someone's creeping around the windows and corridors like a thief. This is no longer a locked room puzzle. This is outright skulking." "Inspector," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle yet firm, "sometimes skulking is exactly the answer to a puzzle, and if we watch carefully, we may find that the very thing you consider reckless may be precisely what leads us to the truth." At that moment, another sharp noise came from the far end of the hall, this one unmistakably a door slamming. The sound reverberated along the corridor and left a hollow echo in the hearts of everyone present. Miss Marple froze, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly, registering the rhythm and force of the slam as though it were a language she had long since learned to read. "Someone is leaving a trail," she murmured almost to herself, "but not the trail they want us to follow." Caldwell spun around. "Again! Where now?" Miss Marple's gaze swept the hall once more, finally settling on the empty doorway of room 309, the thread she had found in the wardrobe still vivid in her memory. "There," she said softly. "That room too has a story to tell. And I think, Inspector, that story is far from finished." Roland looked at her in bewilderment. "Jane, what do you mean? We've already got the body, the windows, the fleeing. It's too much." Miss Marple gave him a serene smile, faintly teasing yet edged with clarity. "Ah, Mr. Sterling, you see, that is exactly why we must watch and listen carefully. The story always tells itself if one has patience, and patience, I assure you, reveals everything." The corridor lay silent again, the faint creak of floorboards and the rustle of curtains the only sounds. Outside, the summer sun glinted off the rose petals, oblivious to the chaos within. But Miss Marple, standing poised, aware of every subtle detail, knew that the next revelation, small, quiet, almost imperceptible, was about to appear, just as a shadow waits patiently for the light to shift. And when it did, the real measure of the mystery's depth would become unmistakably clear. The sudden hush that followed the last door slam was almost tangible, a pause in the usual rhythm of the hotel corridor that made every small sound resonate with disproportionate significance. Miss Marple's eyes swept along the hall, noting details others overlooked. The faint scratch on the edge of the skirting board by room 301, the slight smudge of dirt on the otherwise polished floor, and the subtle way the sunlight caught the corner of a picture frame near the staircase, reflecting off something metallic. Roland Sterling whispered behind her, hesitant, "Do you really think he or she could still be inside the building, after all that running?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "Yes, Mr. Sterling. Very often, when someone appears to be fleeing, they are in fact returning, or hiding, or simply misdirecting attention. People rarely act without purpose, even when they wish it to seem otherwise." The inspector, pacing near the stairwell, was growing increasingly impatient. "Miss Marple, I must insist, this is no time for riddles. Someone has already been murdered, and now we have a suspect, or at least a shadow, darting about the hotel. We need answers, not speculation." "And yet," Miss Marple replied softly, "answers often arrive most clearly when one watches rather than chases." Her gaze drifted back toward the slightly ajar window of room 311. "Notice the angle of the sunlight, Inspector. That small reflection there. It reveals something about the path taken by our visitor. Observe, please." Caldwell frowned, but followed her subtle gesture. The gleam of light traced the edge of the windowsill, showing a faint series of fingerprints, delicate, hurried, and partially wiped away. He bent closer. By Jove, they did touch it. But that proves nothing. Anyone could have... Miss Marple interrupted gently. Yes, Inspector, anyone could have. But fingerprints rarely lie about hesitation, nor the direction of approach. See how the smudges curve inward toward the room rather than outward. Someone entered, or perhaps returned, through this window. Roland's eyebrows knit together. Returned? You mean the same person who ran from the garden earlier? Precisely, she said, her tone mild, though her mind worked swiftly. The same footprints we observed earlier lead toward the greenhouse, but the angle at which they stop, and then continue, suggests a brief, purposeful pause. The person had an objective here, likely to retrieve something or to ensure someone else could not be seen. Caldwell straightened, rubbing his jaw. So this isn't just a man running around. Someone is deliberately staging movements to confuse us. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed. And the very fact that they chose room 301 as their point of misdirection is telling. Whoever occupied this space, or was meant to appear to have occupied it, wants us to believe the impossible, that the room was the destination when, in fact, it was merely a temporary stage. Roland swallowed. But why? Why go through all this trouble? Fear, desperation, or concealment, Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but precise. People rarely act without reason, and often, the more intricate the deception, the closer the truth lies in its minutiae. A sudden noise drew all three toward the end of the corridor. A faint rustling, almost imperceptible, but distinct against the quiet now settling once more. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Listen, not a footstep, not a door slamming, but something else. Roland whispered. A drawer? Something moving inside a room. Miss Marple shook her head slightly. No, something smaller. A misplacement, a movement too slight for panic, yet deliberate. Perhaps a pocket lifted or a note retrieved. The sound repeated, this time slightly louder, emanating from the direction of the service corridor. Caldwell's face darkened. Blast it! I'll go check it. Wait, Miss Marple said, placing a firm hand on his arm. Let us observe first. The person we seek, Tan, may reveal more by being seen than by being chased. Watch the windows, the doorways, the trails of dust and reflection. A pause stretched as the three of them stood silently. Miss Marple's sharp eyes traced the ceiling beams, the corners of the hallway, the faint shadows along the wallpaper, small clues that most would ignore. And then, almost imperceptibly, a curtain fluttered at the far end of the corridor, just beyond the last guest room. A shadow shifted behind it. Miss Marple's lips curved slightly, the faintest hint of anticipation. There, she whispered. Do you see? The trail begins again, and this time it is deliberate, as though the person wishes to be observed. Roland stiffened. Observed? Surely that can't be wise. Perhaps not wise, Miss Marple admitted, but revealing. Often people cannot help themselves. They show what they intend to hide. Caldwell gritted his teeth but followed her gaze. A figure darted from behind the curtain, swift, careful, almost ghost-like. The movement was deliberate, but not hurried, as though the person knew exactly where to step and where to pause. In an instant, they were gone, leaving behind only the faintest disturbance of carpet fibers and the lingering scent Miss Marple had noted earlier, a sharp, citrusy tang, faint yet unmistakable. Miss Marple bent down, examining the small trace. And now, she murmured softly, we have the signature of someone meticulous, precise, and very much alive, and very interested in the outcome of our observations. Roland whispered, Jane, what do we do? Miss Marple straightened, her gaze unwavering along the corridor. We wait, Mr. Sterling, and we watch, for the next movement will tell us more than 100 questions ever could. Outside, the summer light continued to bathe the hotel in a gentle warmth, but within the corridors, The air grew charged with anticipation. Someone had begun a subtle game of observation and misdirection, and Miss Marple, calm and patient, had already begun to read the rules. The corridor remained still for a heartbeat longer than seemed natural. The soft hum of summer from the open windows outside a stark contrast to the tension inside. Then, with a faint shuffle, the shadow reappeared, slipping silently along the edge of the wall near room 310. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone not paying attention. But Miss Marple noticed the slight hesitation in its movement, a pause that betrayed indecision, or perhaps calculation. Roland Sterling's voice was a whisper, tremulous. "Jane, it's him, isn't it? Langford?" Miss Marple shook her head ever so slightly, her eyes narrowing as she tracked the shadow. "Not quite, Mr. Sterling. Watch carefully. The person ahead is taking care not to be seen, but the way they step, the slight hesitation, the manner of touch against the wall. These are the telltale signs of someone very accustomed to observation, and someone who knows how to manipulate it." Inspector Caldwell, meanwhile, was growing impatient. "I don't see anyone. All I see are shadows. This is absurd. If we don't catch him now, he'll vanish completely." Miss Marple placed a hand gently on his arm. "Patience, Inspector. The shadow, whoever it is, will move when it wishes. And right now, it has moved in a particular pattern for a reason." The shadow paused just beyond room 310, and a faint metallic glint caught the sunlight streaming through the hallway windows. Miss Marple leaned closer, her sharp eyes noting the subtle reflection from the edge of a thin object. A letter opener or a small knife, held loosely in the hand. Roland swallowed audibly. "A weapon?" Miss Marple shook her head, almost imperceptibly. "Perhaps, or perhaps merely a prop. But what matters is intention. Someone wishes us to notice, or almost notice, without fully realizing what we see." Suddenly, the shadow moved again, darting down the corridor toward the stairwell. Miss Marple's gaze flicked back to room 309. The faint scuff mark on the window ledge and the indentation of the carpet now made sense in a new light. Whoever had entered, or returned, was not acting randomly. They were retracing steps, ensuring their presence left a pattern, visible only to those who knew how to read it. Roland whispered, his voice tight with anxiety. "Jane, how can you possibly know all that from just shadows and scuff marks?" Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. "Oh, Mr. Sterling, human nature speaks very clearly when one knows how to listen. Every pause, every hesitated step, every careful touch tells a story. And these small details, like threads on a carpet, marks on a sill, are the sentences of that story." The inspector finally noticed her attention and frowned. "You mean to say you've already figured out what's happening?" Miss Marple's eyes remained fixed along the corridor. "Not everything, Inspector, but enough to know that our visitor is not fleeing out of panic, but returning to ensure something is in place, or perhaps to retrieve something that was misplaced." A soft noise drew all three toward the end of the hall, a faint creak from the staircase rail, the brush of fabric against wood. Miss Marple's heart did not race. Her mind was entirely alert. Whoever had manipulated the rooms and windows had also ensured their next movements were predictable, if one knew how to watch. Caldwell muttered under his breath, "I'll never understand it. I'm supposed to find a man by following patterns of hesitation." Miss Marple's gaze flicked to Roland. "Patterns of hesitation often tell more than a confession, Inspector. And this is precisely the point where the cleverest of people make the smallest, almost invisible mistakes." The shadow moved again, toward room 311, pausing just long enough to press lightly against the door handle, leaving a faint fingerprint before retreating slightly. Miss Marple's eyes caught the gleam on the handle, the very same lemony scent she had noticed in room 311 earlier. "Ah," she whispered softly, almost to herself, "and there it is, the smallest detail, the one that betrays intent." Roland turned to her, puzzled. But what does it mean? Miss Marple straightened, her expression calm yet resolute. It means, my dear, that our visitor is not acting alone. Someone is orchestrating the events from behind the scenes. Someone who wishes us to believe in impossibilities, the locked room, the vanished guest, the shadow moving silently. And the real question is, who benefits most from these illusions? Caldwell groaned, rubbing his temples. I should never have let you talk me into this, Mrs. Marple. This is no longer a simple murder investigation. It's a game of ghosts. Miss Marple's eyes glimmered with quiet certainty. Precisely, Inspector, and every ghost leaves a trace, even if it is only for the observant to see. The next move will reveal more than 100 questions ever could. From somewhere deeper within the hotel, a soft click sounded, the unmistakable sound of a lock being turned. All three froze. Miss Marple's eyes glimmered. The trap, she realized, was about to spring, and when it did, it would reveal the truth concealed behind the shadowed corridors and the carefully staged misdirections. The soft click of the lock resonated down the hallway like a chime announcing a revelation. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed imperceptibly, her mind aligning the scattered threads she had been gathering over the past hours. Roland Sterling's breathing grew shallow beside her, while Inspector Caldwell's jaw was set in an expression that suggested both irritation and reluctant attention. From the far end of the corridor, the handle of room 301 rattled lightly. A faint shadow moved behind the frosted glass panel of the door. Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. Ah, she murmured. There it is. The moment when pretense can no longer be maintained. Roland whispered urgently. Jane, should we call out to them? Not yet, she said softly. Observe first. People reveal themselves by what they cannot help but do, not what they wish us to see. Slowly, deliberately, the door opened. The figure behind it stepped into view, a woman, mid-30s, elegant but with a tightness to her posture that betrayed tension and fear. Her eyes widened as they fell upon Caldwell, Roland, and Miss Marple. In her hand, the faint glint of metal, a letter opener, caught the sunlight streaming through the corridor window. Caldwell barked, "Step aside! Drop whatever that is!" The woman's hand trembled. I didn't—" Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice soft, calm, almost coaxing. "Do not be afraid, my dear. There is no need for haste. It is quite clear that fear has guided your actions thus far. But panic, I assure you, only complicates matters." The woman's gaze shifted from Caldwell to Miss Marple. You know, you understand." "Yes," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle yet firm. "I understand a great deal, but I am not here to judge you unfairly. That requires patience, careful observation, and honesty. And if you are willing to speak truthfully, the path will become far simpler for everyone." The tension in the woman's shoulders softened slightly, though the metallic glint in her hand remained a silent testimony to her anxiety. Slowly, she lowered it to her side. "It was supposed to be simple," she said, voice quivering. "I only meant to frighten him. He knew too much. About the arrangements, about the will, everything." Miss Marple's eyes brightened just a fraction. "The arrangements, yes, that aligns with what I suspected. And the locked door." The woman's lips trembled. He was not meant to be found like that. I did not kill him. I only meant to ensure he could not interfere." Her voice broke. Roland whispered, "But then, how did he die?" Miss Marple regarded the body of Martin Grayson in room 309 as though recalling every detail. "An unfortunate accident," she said softly. "A sudden slip, perhaps, the consequence of tension and haste. The bolt was manipulated, the door staged to create the appearance of impossibility, but the act itself, unplanned, unintended, though terribly consequential. The woman's face paled. I never meant... And yet, Miss Marple continued, your hand in this matter is clear through subtler indications. The altered trajectory, the note removed from the writing pad, the precise placement of items to suggest absence or presence. The intention was concealment, not harm. But sometimes concealment carries consequences one cannot foresee. Inspector Caldwell exhaled, tension leaving his frame in a visible wave. So, she didn't kill him? It was an accident. Yes, Miss Marple replied, but it was no less serious. The threads of motive, deception, and fear intertwined in a manner that, to the casual observer, appeared like malice, and therein lies the danger of misinterpretation. The woman sank into a nearby chair, covering her face with her hands. Roland stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. It's all right now. Miss Marple understands. Miss Marple's eyes swept the corridor one last time. And now, she murmured, the patterns, the shadows, the small disturbances. All make sense. The game is concluded, and yet we are reminded that human nature often leads us into situations far more intricate than any locked door could suggest. Caldwell shook his head, still processing the revelation. I must admit, I never saw it coming. Not the accident, not the staging, not the cleverness behind it all. Miss Marple smiled faintly, a delicate curve of satisfaction. Cleverness often wears the mask of impossibility, Inspector. But once one watches carefully, listens attentively, and notices the smallest details, even the most intricate puzzle yields its secrets. Outside, the soft breeze stirred the rose petals along the walkway, as if the world itself were exhaling in relief. The hotel returned, slowly, to a semblance of calm, and Miss Marple, ever serene, allowed herself a small, contemplative smile. For in the quiet that followed, she reflected once again on human nature, unpredictable, delicate, and always capable of weaving mysteries even the cleverest minds might take years to unravel. The hotel corridors were quiet now, though the tension still clung to the walls like a thin veil. Guests peered cautiously from their rooms, whispering behind half-open doors, while staff moved about with careful diligence, tidying up and attempting to restore normality. The garden below was calm once more, the fete continuing in muted fashion, as if the morning's events had been nothing more than an unfortunate interruption. Miss Marple lingered near the doorway of room 311, observing the woman seated on the chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Roland Sterling hovered nearby, still pale but evidently relieved, while Inspector Caldwell moved back and forth, dictating notes to his constables with an unusual air of deference toward Miss Marple. Now, she said softly, drawing everyone's attention, we must understand that while the immediate danger has passed, the repercussions of fear and secrecy linger. It is seldom the act itself that unsettles a community. It is the uncertainty surrounding it. And here, in Brackendale, there is much that has been uncertain. The woman lifted her face, tear-streaked but more composed, meeting Miss Marple's calm gaze. I see that now. I never wished harm. Only control, only the assurance that things would proceed as I planned. Yes, Miss Marple said gently, and yet control, when combined with fear, can create consequences entirely unanticipated. Mr. Grayson's death, tragic as it was, teaches us how fragile intentions can be. Caldwell, still running through his mental reconstruction of the events, interjected. So, to be clear, you staged the locked room, manipulated the windows and notes, all to make it appear as though... Exactly, Miss Marple confirmed, all to make it appear that Mr. Grayson's demise was more sinister than it truly was. But in orchestrating the illusion, certain details betrayed the reality. The footprints, the scuff marks, the thread in the wardrobe, and the small traces of scent left behind. These minute elements revealed more than the dramatics of the act itself could conceal. Roland frowned thoughtfully. And all of this could have been noticed? only because you observed it carefully. Precisely, Miss Marple replied. The subtleties of human behavior and environmental evidence are far more telling than loud declarations or panic-induced actions. One must listen to the silence, watch the hesitation, note the inconsistencies. That is where truth resides. The woman shook her head, her voice trembling. I suppose it was foolish. I didn't anticipate how quickly everything would unravel. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Not foolish, my dear. Merely human. People often miscalculate when emotions dictate their actions. The cleverest schemes are undone by the smallest overlooked detail, and that is the lesson here. But it is also a lesson in compassion. Accidents, even tragic ones, demand understanding as much as judgment. Caldwell, now quieter, looked at Miss Marple with a new appreciation. I confess, I underestimated the value of this kind of observation. I was ready to charge, to conclude, but I see now that patience and careful attention reveal far more than force ever could. Roland glanced at Miss Marple, admiration evident in his expression. Jane, it's extraordinary. You can see the whole picture from fragments, shadows, threads, even scents. She gave him a soft, almost teasing smile. Fragments, Mr. Sterling, are often all that life offers us, but fragments, when carefully considered, form a mosaic far greater than the sum of its pieces. And it is in that mosaic that we find understanding and sometimes justice. The woman sighed, relief mingling with lingering fear. Then, I am not guilty of murder. Not of intentional harm, Miss Marple replied. But accountable for your actions, yes. That is the difference between consequence and culpability, and it is a lesson all of us, in one form or another, must learn. A silence fell over the corridor, not of tension, but of resolution. Outside, the soft rustle of leaves and the distant laughter of fete-goers reminded them that life continued. Miss Marple straightened, her eyes sweeping the hallway one last time, noting the marks and traces that had told her everything. Now, she said quietly, Brackendale may return to its ordinary rhythms. But let us remember that ordinary does not mean simple. People harbor fears, secrets, and ambitions, and though we may restore calm, human nature continues, delicate, intricate, and capable of weaving mysteries in the most unsuspecting places. Roland looked at her, a mix of awe and gratitude in his eyes. And you, Jane, you will always see what the rest of us overlook. She gave a faint, serene smile. One must only be willing to watch, to wait, and to listen. The truth, after all, is never truly hidden. It merely waits for those who know how to see it. And as the soft afternoon light streamed through the corridor windows, touching the polished floors and the faint traces of a mystery now resolved, Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet sigh of satisfaction. The threads had been unraveled, the hidden pattern revealed, and Brackendale, at least for a time, could breathe again, though with the gentle awareness that behind every calm surface, human nature continued its intricate, inexhaustible dance. Even as the last guests began to retreat to their rooms, whispering in low tones about the day's dramatic events, Miss Marple lingered in the corridor, her gaze sweeping over every corner with the quiet diligence that had never failed her. Roland Sterling hovered beside her, still pale but steadier now, while Inspector Caldwell moved on to make his formal inquiries and write his notes, leaving Miss Marple with the calm authority of one who had seen the whole tapestry of the affair and understood its weave. The woman from room 311 remained seated, her hands folded in her lap, a mixture of relief and lingering anxiety on her face. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly. "If it weren't for you, everything would have seemed far more hopeless." Miss Marple smiled, small and composed. "You need only thank yourself, my dear. People often create their own complications, but it is their own courage and honesty in the aftermath that untangles them. You acted out of fear, not malice, and that truth is always easier to live with than a lie. Roland, still trying to digest the morning's events, ventured cautiously, "Jane, it's astonishing, really. You saw the threads in the carpet, the smudge on the window, the hesitation in his footsteps, and it all led to understanding the whole story. How did you know which details mattered?" Miss Marple tilted her head, thoughtful. "Ah, Mr. Sterling, that comes with years of observation and a keen attention to human nature. People reveal themselves not only through words or deeds, but through the smallest inconsistencies, the tiniest gestures. One must only learn to read them carefully, as if they were letters on a page." Inspector Caldwell, overhearing, approached with a rare look of respect mingled with lingering skepticism. "Mrs. Marple, I confess, I have witnessed your deductions, and yet I remain amazed. It's not merely observation, it is insight. You perceive intention where most of us perceive only circumstance." Miss Marple inclined her head politely. "Insight, Inspector, is little more than patient attention. The truth is patient. It waits for those willing to see it without rush or assumption. And in human affairs, the smallest details often matter more than the grandest gestures." The woman, gathering herself slowly, finally stood. "I shall face what comes next honestly," she said, her voice steadier now. "And I shall remember the lesson, that fear and secrecy can weave tragedies if one is not careful." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "And remember also that honesty, once embraced, restores a great deal. It may not erase the consequences entirely, but it clarifies the path forward. Brackendale will continue, and you will continue with it. But now, with a clearer understanding of your own choices." Roland exhaled, a faint smile breaking across his face. "It's over then. The mystery solved, the danger past, and life will return to its ordinary rhythm." So Miss Marple allowed herself a small, approving nod. "Life always returns, Mr. Sterling, but it is never quite as simple as it seems. People carry their secrets, their ambitions, and their fears, and even when a mystery is resolved, its memory lingers in the quiet corners of a place like this. That is why observation is so vital. It reminds us that human nature, though complex, is never unknowable if approached with patience and care." Caldwell, now collecting himself, gave a final deliberate nod toward Miss Marple. "Thank you, Mrs. Marple. Brackendale, and I suppose I owe you a great deal." She inclined her head with gentle grace. "No thanks are necessary, Inspector. One must only do what one can, and let events reveal themselves as they will. The human heart is intricate, and the truth, however hidden, is always there to be discerned, if one knows how to look." And with that, Miss Marple allowed herself to step back, her gaze drifting toward the hotel windows that caught the soft afternoon light. The shadows and disturbances that had once threatened to baffle the authorities now lay still, and Brackendale Hotel resumed its quiet dignity. The small town would soon forget much of the drama, but Miss Marple knew that beneath the calm surface, the subtle lessons of fear, secrecy, and human frailty would linger. With a serene sigh, she turned toward the stairwell, ready to retreat to her own quiet contemplation. The threads had been carefully unraveled, the hidden patterns exposed, and the mystery, both human and circumstantial, resolved. Brackendale, for now, could breathe again, though its inhabitants would forever carry the gentle reminder that behind the most ordinary facades, human nature could weave its most intricate and sometimes deadly designs. And as Miss Marple descended the staircase, her mind quietly cataloguing the lessons of the day, she reflected once more on the delicate dance of observation and understanding, of fear and courage, and the subtle, inexhaustible complexity of the human heart.